We are accustomed to seeing heroes and villains in history, but what if the most monumental figures of the past were merely skilled illusionists? What if a ruthless hunger for power and money lurked behind the facade of greatness? Today we dissect the story of Stefan Zanovich, a man who deceived an entire era, making kings, bankers, and even themselves believe in him. Stefan Zanovich, a man whose true origins were as obscure as the deepest Montenegrin fjords, was not born into a noble family. Despite his later claims of an ancient princely lineage spanning centuries, he was, in all likelihood, merely a shadow emerging from the humble quarters of Venice, perhaps even an orphan. Yet, within him burned an insatiable thirst for status and wealth, which became the driving force of his incredible, yet criminal career. His youth remains a mystery, a blank slate upon which he later painted the most improbable fictions. Armed only with incredible audacity, a phenomenal memory for faces and facts, and an astonishing ability to read people like an open book, he began his journey. He was a self-made man, molding the image of a European prince from ambition and the mud of his origins. He forged genealogies and coats of arms, fabricated letters from monarchs with fake seals, issued astonishingly convincing counterfeit decrees, and even printed his own diplomatic passports, complete with non-existent visas and stamps. He made Europe his stage, turning its capitals into a chessboard for his grand schemes. In Venice, he sold non-existent trade concessions, promising exorbitant profits. In Paris, he extorted vast sums from aristocrats under the guise of investing in fantastical mining projects in distant lands, where, he claimed, gold lay just beneath the surface. In Amsterdam, he impersonated a representative of a powerful Eastern power, offering incredible loans at ridiculously low interest rates, instantly attracting greedy financiers. He gambled on human avarice, vanity, the desire for easy money, and an endless willingness to believe in miracles. He promised titles, lands, untold riches, or political influence to anyone willing to believe his incredible tales. His mastery lay not only in virtuoso deception, but also in his ability to disappear when the net began to close, leaving behind only financial ruins, reputational disgrace, and entire families on the brink of bankruptcy. He constantly changed names, clothes, and accents, creating new identities with such ease as if shedding old skin. A trail of deceived secretaries, bribed servants, and naive accomplices who believed in his supposed grandeur until the very end followed him. Thus, step by step, through hundreds of scams and thousands of lies, he became far more than just a swindler. He became a legend of his time. Prince Stefan Zanovich, self-proclaimed ruler of Montenegro, and at times Albania, Count Castriotto, an adventurer whispered about in Europe's highest salons. He became a man who managed to fool kings and empresses, from Frederick the Great to Catherine the Great, extracting colossal sums from their treasuries, sometimes hundreds of thousands, even millions of livres, florins, and ducats. This money, equivalent to tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars today, vanished into the impostor's bottomless pockets. He became not merely a deceiver, but a symbol of the Enlightenment era itself, where reason battled the irrational, and people, even the most enlightened, proved remarkably vulnerable to a genius performance. His name became synonymous with grand mystification, his methods a subject of study, and his persona a constant source of gossip and astonishment in European courts and financial centers. But even the most masterful game had to end. Zanovich was caught and imprisoned several times, in Venice, in Paris, in Amsterdam. Each time he managed to escape, sometimes through bribery, sometimes through incredible luck or dazzling charm. However, the circle was tightening. Finally, in 1786, after another attempt to secure a huge loan from a Dutch banker, he was arrested in Amsterdam. This time, escape was impossible. He was incarcerated in the infamous Rasfuis prison, where he is believed to have committed suicide a few months later, hanging himself with his own neckerchief. Thus ended the career of the greatest impostor, whose death left more questions than answers, but whose life eloquently demonstrated how fragile the line between reality and fantasy becomes when vast sums of money and power are at stake. This is not a story of a noble bandit or a brilliant adventurer who simply played by his own rules. This is the story of a predator who ruthlessly exploited human weaknesses, greed, vanity, naivety, and an endless belief in miracles. Zanovich was not a hero. He was a parasite, leaving behind not a legend, but only debts, ruin, and shattered hopes. His genius lay not in creating something new, but in masterfully destroying trust. He was not a creator, but a destroyer, whose life is not a romantic saga, but a harsh chronicle of one of the 18th century's most extensive and cynical crimes, a grim harbinger of the era of great financial pyramids and global hoaxes. However, to truly dissect the Zanovich phenomenon, one must look beyond the screen of his brilliant schemes, into the fog of his youth, where this monstrous yet captivating personality was formed. We know that he was merely a shadow emerging from the humble quarters of Venice, perhaps even an orphan. But what exactly in that environment spawned such a predator? Imagine 18th century Venice, a city of contrasts, where the luxury of patricians coexisted with abject poverty, where social mobility existed only for the chosen few, and for someone like Zanovich, the path upward was completely blocked. It was in this suffocating atmosphere, permeated with the scent of canals and the thirst for money, that his character began to take shape. Having neither noble birth, nor capital, nor even a legitimate name, Zanovich faced an absolute barrier. His childhood, if he had one at all, gave him nothing but a harsh lesson. The world is unjust, and the only things that matter are power and money, to which he had no access. Perhaps it was then, in his early youth, when other children were learning the basics of a trade or preparing for service, that Zanovich realized a simple yet destructive truth. If society doesn't give you a chance to rise by the rules, it is itself to blame if you break those rules. This thought, like a poisonous seed, took deep root in his mind. He was not a victim of circumstances. He was their product, who decided not to submit, but to overturn the board. For a man without roots, without a future, without a name, the only way to survive and succeed was through a total denial of reality. He didn't just want to be rich or noble. He wanted to be someone he wasn't, and to make the whole world believe in this fabricated reality. This was not merely a pursuit of gain, but a deeply ingrained psychological mechanism of compensation, a grandiose revenge on a world that had rejected him. Every forged seal, every false letter, every duped aristocrat, these were not just acts of fraud, but assertions of his own, invented grandeur. He did not see himself as a criminal. He saw himself as a genius who outsmarted the system, using its own weaknesses: greed, vanity, naivety. The turning point, the point of no return, was likely his first successful, albeit minor, fraud. Perhaps it was a small forgery of a bill of exchange, or a successful sale of non-existent goods, or the deception of some naive merchant. The moment he saw how easily people fell for tricks, how eagerly they reached for promised wealth and status, he realized he had found his calling. This was not a path to crime, but a path to absolute freedom from norms and morality. Each subsequent success only strengthened this conviction. He felt no remorse because his victims, in his view, were as greedy and vain as he was and deserved to be deceived. He did not steal from the innocent. He took from those who themselves craved easy gain, and in this he saw his own twisted justice. Thus, step by step, from petty deception to grand international schemes, Stefan Zanovich transformed into the embodiment of cynicism and unscrupulousness, for whom the entire world became merely a backdrop for his unending, mortally dangerous game. The 18th century, the age of enlightenment, was not merely an era of triumphant rational reason. It was a time of unprecedented contrasts, grandiose changes, and incredible credulity, an ideal environment for the flourishing of figures like Zanovich. Old monarchies, shaken by wars and revolutionary ideas, desperately clung to power, but their treasuries were depleted, and the trust of their subjects was waning. Europe was a colorful tapestry of warring and intriguing courts, where diplomacy often bordered on espionage, and rumors carried the weight of official decrees. There was no unified system of identity verification. Passports were rare, and information spread slowly and was often distorted. In this intricate web of intrigues and unreliable information, anyone with sufficient boldness and charisma could impersonate anyone. From an ambassador to a lost prince. The political map of the continent was constantly being redrawn. The 7 Years' War, which shook the foundations of many states, was underway, followed by the first partitions of Poland, demonstrating the cynicism and unscrupulousness of the great powers. Kings and empresses, from Frederick the Great to Catherine the Great, were consumed by an endless struggle for territories, resources, and influence. They sought new allies, new sources of funding, new ways to solidify their shaky power. In this context, exotic offers of loans from mysterious Eastern princes or investments in the untold riches of distant lands, however fantastical they seemed, found fertile ground. Desperation and the thirst for superiority made them vulnerable to anyone who promised a quick solution to their problems. Europe's economy was experiencing rapid growth, but it was chaotic and poorly regulated. Early capitalism was taking shape, with banks, stock exchanges, and trading companies multiplying. New financial instruments, stocks, bonds, bills of exchange, emerged, which few fully understood. Speculation reached unprecedented levels, creating entire fortunes overnight and bankrupting thousands of families the next morning. In this feverish atmosphere, where quick enrichment became a new religion and risk was considered noble, enterprising fraudsters like Zanovich felt right at home. They offered incredibly profitable deals, promised exorbitant interest rates, and access to closed markets, playing on the greed and inexperience of both aristocrats and newly rich financiers. The lack of transparency and state control over financial operations opened up vast opportunities for anyone who could manipulate numbers and trust. The social environment of the 18th century was steeped in vanity and the pursuit of status. Titles, nobility, and proximity to the court were valued above gold. At the same time, the ideas of the Enlightenment, despite their rational basis, created a fashion for everything unusual, mysterious, and exotic. European salons were full of adventurers, philosophers, mystics, and charlatans, each striving to win the attention and patronage of the powerful. People believed in secret societies, ancient orders, miraculous discoveries, and hidden knowledge that could bring power and wealth. It was an era when the line between science and alchemy, between fact and fiction, was astonishingly thin. Any story told convincingly enough, any deception supported by sufficient audacity, could be taken at face value, especially if it promised the fulfillment of the most cherished desires, be it untold wealth, political influence, or simply high status. In this complex, contradictory, and naive era, where old rules were breaking down and new ones had not yet solidified, adventurers like Zanovich found boundless opportunities for their brilliant yet destructive games. He began in Venice, where the canals seemed to hide no fewer secrets than his own past. Here, in the birthplace of commerce and intrigue, Zanovich didn't just sell air, he sold the future. Posing as a representative of an influential Eastern prince, supposedly interested in large-scale trade ventures connecting Venice with exotic Asian markets, he created the illusion of official diplomacy. He opened a luxurious office, hired secretaries who had no inkling of his true identity, and even sent out invitations to receptions where he shone with wit and promises of untold profits. His victims were wealthy merchants and patricians, hungry for new sources of income. Zanovich offered them exclusive concessions for the supply of rare goods, from spices to precious stones, requiring only advance payments or guarantee deposits to secure these deals. The sums amounted to thousands of ducats, and dozens of influential families invested their fortunes in these phantom projects. When the delivery deadline approached, Zanovich typically vanished, leaving behind only lavish promises and empty accounts, while the deceived investors were left with the bitter realization of their own naivety and irrevocably lost money. From Venice, Zanovich's path led to Paris, the heart of European aristocracy, where titles and vanity, not money, reigned supreme. Here he exchanged his merchant's mask for the guise of a mysterious prince, possessing maps of untold gold and diamond mines in distant corners of the world, be it Africa, America, or the enigmatic Balkan lands he now claimed as his dominion. He arranged private meetings in the most prestigious salons, displaying forged geological maps, mineral samples, and even fake letters from local chieftains, supposedly confirming his rights to these riches. His goal was not just money, but investments in the development of these deposits. He convinced counts and marquises that for a small share of the investment, they would receive fabulous dividends, and their names would go down in history as patrons of the greatest discoveries. He sold shares in non-existent companies, promising returns that exceeded any reasonable percentage. Tens of thousands of livres flowed from the pockets of the nobility into Zanovich's bottomless coffers, as he skillfully played on their greed and desire for even greater splendor. He could convince the most astute financier that their fortune would multiply tenfold, or even 100-fold, if they would only believe his word. The culmination of his career involved schemes that affected not just individual merchants or aristocrats, but entire state treasuries and major European banks. In Amsterdam, the financial center of the world, Zanovich donned the grandest of his masks, an ambassador or representative of a powerful Eastern power, most often the Ottoman Empire or some fictional Balkan principality he supposedly intended to liberate from Ottoman rule. He offered governments and major bankers loans on utterly unthinkable terms, enormous sums amounting to millions at negligible, sometimes even negative interest rates. Why? Ostensibly to strengthen ties, demonstrate power, or secure future trade privileges. In reality, it was a classic advance fee scam. Zanovich demanded huge commissions, or administrative fees, for processing these loans, which of course never materialized. He created complex networks of intermediaries, often using unsuspecting but influential people. One of his most audacious plans involved an attempt to deceive Catherine the Great herself. He sent letters to St. Petersburg, offering her an alliance and enormous loans on behalf of a prince of Montenegro, who supposedly controlled untold riches and could become a valuable ally in the struggle against the Ottoman Empire. Although Zanovich never reached the Russian court in person, his letters and agents managed to extract tens of thousands of rubles from the imperial treasury for preliminary expenses and diplomatic gifts. He made similar attempts with Frederick the Great, King of Prussia, offering him financial assistance or military subsidies on behalf of his imaginary principalities. The Prussian king, known for his pragmatism, was more cautious, but even he became involved in correspondence with this enigmatic prince, spending funds to verify his identity and proposals, which of course proved to be fictitious. Zanovich played on the global political arena, exploiting the geopolitical ambitions of monarchs and their constant need for money. He understood that in a world where everyone sought an advantage, the promise of untold wealth or strategic alliances was the most powerful hook. However, Stefan Zanovich's terrifying genius was not isolated. Every one of his grand schemes, whether a minor deception or a large-scale state mystification, inevitably drew a host of figures into its orbit, from high nobility to petty clerks, from ambitious financiers to naive servants. All of them, in one way or another, became either unwitting patrons, eager accomplices, or ultimately, victims of his ruthless game. At the apex of this pyramid stood the monarchs, Frederick the Great and Catherine the Great, whose names were already linked to his schemes. They were not his direct patrons in the traditional sense, but their thirst for power, new territories, and financial stability made them ideal targets. Zanovich offered them what they desperately sought: immense loans capable of shoring up depleted treasuries, or exotic alliances promising strategic advantage. He played on their geopolitical ambitions, presenting himself as the ruler of a rich but enigmatic Balkan principality, capable of becoming a significant player on the European chessboard. To them, he was not merely an adventurer, but a potential solution to their problems, a mystical source of strength and wealth that could tip the balance of power on the continent. Their willingness to negotiate with him, to allocate funds for preliminary expenses or diplomatic gifts, sometimes amounting to tens or even hundreds of thousands of livres and rubles, effectively legitimized his status and granted him colossal influence. Each such contact, each successfully extracted sum, served as confirmation of his perceived greatness, setting a precedent for further, even bolder schemes. Monarchs, blinded by the prospect of easy gain or strategic superiority, unwittingly became his most powerful advertisers, spreading rumors of a mysterious and powerful prince. Below them, But no less important were the bankers and aristocrats, the main beneficiaries, or rather, those who hoped to become so, and whose fortunes were ultimately lost forever. In Amsterdam, the center of global financial power, Zanovich found financiers blinded by the prospect of unprecedented profits from state loans at symbolic interest. He promised them access to government contracts, monopolies on trade with the East, and even shares in non-existent mines where, he claimed, gold lay just beneath the surface. In Paris, among high society, he sold dreams of even greater wealth and status, offering investments in gold veins in distant lands. These individuals, driven by avarice and vanity, became accomplices in his deception, actively spreading rumors of his influence and wealth, drawing their friends and partners into the schemes. They invested not only money, but also their authority, thereby amplifying Zanovich's aura. They were the ones who poured in fabulous sums, sometimes reaching hundreds of thousands of ducats and livres, which by then constituted entire fortunes, hoping for a tenfold return, and it was their ruin that became the clearest evidence of his destructive activity. Their greed for enrichment eclipsed any common sense, turning them into perfect puppets in the hands of the master illusionist. But for every person who succumbed to Zanovich's charm, there were also those who sought to unmask him and stop this rampant deception. His career was a series of daring escapes, but each time a shadow followed close behind him. The shadow of the law, the shadow of the deceived, the shadow of the states whose money he had stolen. The main antagonist in this deadly game, whose shadow loomed over Zanovich, was not a single individual, but the European justice system itself, in the person of its most principled and persistent representatives. Police prefects, desperate diplomats, ruined. Bankers, and even personal envoys of monarchs, all of them, united or acting alone, represented the force that, step by step, tightened the noose around the impostor. Their struggle against Zanovich was a battle of reason against the irrational, facts against fiction, law against lawlessness. Among them, the Dutch banker Jan van der Velde particularly stands out, whose caution and principles played a fateful role in the final act of this drama. It was his refusal to grant Zanovich a huge loan, amounting to hundreds of thousands of guilders, without proper verification, and then his insistence on involving the authorities, that led to the adventurer's final arrest in Amsterdam in 1786. Van der Velde did not succumb to the promises of immense profits, preferring common sense and legality over immediate gain, despite colossal pressure and temptation. He became a symbol of the rare resistance Zanovich encountered on his path, and which ultimately led to his downfall. This confrontation between the ingenious deceiver and those who sought to restore justice not only concluded his story, it exposed the vulnerability of an entire era to brilliantly executed lies.